Hello, and welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're going to be talking about visual learning, whether or not you can learn the law by looking at funny pictures or videos. Your Law School Toolbox host is Lee Burgess, that's me. I'm here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Allison Monahan and I are the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Conference, and the Trebuchet Legal Career site. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back. Today, we're very excited to have Kipp Mueller, the co-founder and CEO of SketchyLaw, an online education company which teaches legal rules by the use of visual learning. He is a 2014 graduate of Columbia Law School and an admitted attorney. Today, he's going to talk to us a bit more about visual learning and why it might be something you want to learn more about. So with that, let's get started. All right, Kipp, so first off, can you give us a brief overview of what visual learning even is? Because I'll be honest, when you emailed me, I really had no idea what you were talking about.
Yeah, fair enough. So, first off, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity.
No problem.
Let me thank you on behalf of your listeners, because this is really a wonderful resource for law students. And it's one I wish I took more advantage of when I was in law school. And I think the work you guys do for law students is so great, because law school is really tough and guidance can be pretty scarce at a lot of schools. So thank you guys.
No problem. I'll take flattery anytime. So no problem.
And your question is a good question. And I think the question of what visual learning is one that I think future generations will be able to answer much better, because I think it's going to be a lot more commonplace pretty soon. So basically, educational innovators and cognitive scientists have started to come together and ask, how do we optimize learning based on what we know about the brain? And how do we make information stick better? And really the question is just, what does the brain prefer? So there's these MIT cognitive scientists who have written a lot recently about the issue. And they found basically that information sticks a lot better when it's visualized. The theory behind it's kind of simple and easy to digest. It's basically that brains have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years from ancestral species before humans, and written language has been around for 10,000 years at most. So we really haven't evolved to take in a lot of information through text form. And our brains are much more designed to memorize information visually, because that's how we've evolved. So in terms of what visual learning is, I can kind of talk about it in terms of what we do. But visual learning can be a lot of things. What we do is take information and we repackage it into visual sort of memory palaces. And so what you're actually just watching is a sketch that's being drawn. And as it's drawn, everything that's in this sketch is going to represent a concept or a rule or an exception to a rule, and it's all figurative. So what I mean by that is, if we're teaching murder for criminal law, we're not literally drawing a murder that took place, right?
That could be a little violent. I don't know.
That could definitely be violent and not particularly helpful. I think we all, have seen Law and Order and we know how this goes.
You'd have to have a PG-13 rating on it or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So what we do is we symbolize everything. So with our murder sketch, we have a haunted house, and it's called the Malice Palace. And everything that's on this palace represents what you need to know about malice. And then in front of the house are some trees for the degrees, first degree and second degree. As an example, on the palace itself that represents malice, we have a gargoyle on it, and it's winking. And winking is our recurring symbol for something being implied. So anything that has to do with that gargoyle is going to have to do with implied malice. And he's got, an exposed, disgusting black heart to help you remember depraved heart, which is another term for implied malice and is related with it. So we draw these figurative sketches. We have these recurring symbols that show up in multiple sketches, such as a wink always means implied. A crown always means intent. And we find that it sticks better. It's really easy. You watch a video and you walk away and you'll remember a lot of it. And in fact, all the memory masters use this technique. You may have already heard of the term memory palaces. I'm not sure, but
I mean, I think I have in my, geeky little group of people who talk about how to learn stuff, but I don't think I learned really about that, even though I was a psych major in college until, I started helping people memorize things.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy. It sounds like a whole thing, but really, honestly, you just watch a video or even just look at a picture. And if somebody's, figuratively represented everything, it just sticks. It's effortless. And so like the memory masters, they when they want to memorize a deck of cards, it's impossible to do it textually, which would be the equivalent of, just looking at each card one by one and being like Jack of Diamonds, Ace of Spades. It's not possible. But what they all do is sort of organize the cards. They visualize something. So a Jack might be like Jay-Z or something. And they organize what they're visualizing around their own family home. So they literally like create a memory palace in their own brain. And what we do is just make the memory palace for you in the world of law. So you don't have to make it yourself. It's just there and you can learn that way. So,
and that's one of the questions I had was, does the science really support if there's any difference between making the memory palace yourself or using someone else's memory palace? Because I think with mnemonics, which is another memory tool, some people find somebody can just give them a mnemonic. But then I think some people also find if I make my own mnemonic, it might be best. Is there any science behind that? Or is it really just having that visual representation and making it your own that's really the big difference?
That's a really good question. And I haven't seen in my... I'm not a PhD of cognitive science, but nothing that I've seen has referenced a difference between the two. It's really just having the visualization available to you. I think, obviously, if you're creating it yourself, you're probably diving pretty deep into your brain and really storing it.
Right.
And, you want to obviously do that when a visual is being handed to you as well. But I don't think difficult. I don't think it's difficult to do that. I think I haven't seen a difference, but that's a really interesting question. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a different, type of learning and study material than, say, using someone else's outline. Because one of the things that we talk about a lot with our tutoring students and when we talk to law students generally is if somebody just hands you an outline, a 100-page outline, a 50-page outline. Please don't read someone's 100-page outline. But, you can't just put your name on it and be like, we're good to go. Because that material isn't really your own. But I do see that maybe this visualization or this visual learning category of documents or materials is a bit different. And if you're watching them kind of sketch it out in this video process, maybe it's a little bit more like you're watching the process, and it's more like using someone else's flow chart rather than someone's whole outline.
Yeah, it would be the equivalent of you're sitting with somebody who's writing an outline line by line, and you guys are talking about it as you go through it, rather than being handed one. The biggest problem in law school with that, and a lot of people do download outlines and read them for a few days and go take their test, is just that you haven't digested the materials. You're just trying to rewrite them, not even really conceptualizing them and like relating them to various other concepts in the class. You're not doing the deep analysis. What we try to do is take you through all of that analysis. So that's why we draw the sketch in front of you. So as it's being drawn, it's an interactive atmosphere. It's not a passive learning, and passive learning is really, I think, what you want to avoid in law school.
Agreed. Yes, we talk a lot about active learning because I think in law school a lot of people really get kind of sucked into this idea that the passive learning is where the answer is. And we also work with bar students, and if anybody out there is studying for the bar or has the bar coming in this summer, please don't just spend all your time doing passive listening to lectures and reading of outlines. It's not going to get you where you need to be. Not going to happen. So active learning is so important.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, that's super interesting. So you're a lawyer. Why did you start working in the visual learning space? Yeah,
that's a good question. And that was one I was asking myself for a while when I first took this on. So I graduated, I took the bar, and I was working in a DA's office, and I was doing consumer fraud work, and it was fantastic. that's something really I think more students should look into is experience in criminal law. It's really fascinating.
I agree. I have criminal law experience myself, although just summer in law school, but still it is fascinating stuff.
It's really great. And the experience is amazing because you're really litigating every day. You're in court. You're behind the bigger kind of macro strategy as well as the micro, writing motions and everything else. So you get the full gambit.
And prosecutors can be kind of funny, hilarious people, in my opinion. And that's not just because I was also raised by a prosecutor. But,
right. Oh, cool. Nice. Yeah. They're an interesting bunch. And public defenders too. Both sides are just
that's
like
true.
really
litigators
really
in
great.
general.
Right, definitely. Yeah. So my buddy actually started the company. He started Sketchy Medical. It was Sketchy Micro. And what he did was he was drawing pictures in his classes when he had to learn about salmonella or something. He would draw the treatments and symptoms because he could digest the material a lot easier when he did that. And people sitting next to him were like, "Hey, can I get a copy of that? That looks cool." And he's like, "Sure." And he made a couple copies. And then eventually enough people asked for it to where he put it on a Facebook page, the Facebook page for the med school he was at. And then he put it on a blog because more people were contacting him that he hadn't met. And it was just a single drawing. It wasn't what we have now, which is, a sketch like being drawn and a narration. It was just the visualization itself. And he went back to this blog like a month later and it had tens of thousands of views, hundreds of comments, people just like, where is this? How do I get my hands on this?
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. And so he realized, there's a huge vacuum in visual learning, and especially in postgraduate studies. So he pursued it with a couple friends in med school, and they did it during med school and were really successful. They've been around about 3 years, and they've done a fantastic job. And he reached out to me, and I was doing a clerkship, and I was interviewing for a full-time position, and basically just offered me a deal that was hard to pass up. And he pitched the whole thing to me. I mean, I knew about visual learning, but I really hadn't learned a ton about it at the time. I had used it to some extent, but it all made a ton of sense. And his fans for Sketchy Medical on their end, and this isn't me bragging because I'm on their coattails now and it's not me, but they have just like a cultish following now. I mean, people, if you know anybody, and I would challenge people listening to this, if you know anybody who's a first or second year in med school, they should know what Sketchy Medical is. It's like they blew up, and it's really cool. And I'm on their coattails and hoping to replicate it kind of, but it's not even just testament to them, it's testament to the nature of visual learning and how much of a vacuum there was and is still. So that's kind of how I got brought in. Actually, honestly, it was my buddy. But
hey, that works.
Yeah. I got well, there.
Leaving the space for visual learning for a second, Allison and I frequently talk about, what you can gain from law school to apply to doing something entrepreneurial, which you're definitely doing, which is what we are doing after some brief stints practicing law. And so, kind of off topic, do you think you gained any skills in law school that have helped you kind of dive into this role in this business and do something in this kind of creative space?
That's a good question. I'm of the belief that, and I want to fight this, but I think there's an inertia in law school that kind of goes the other way that sort of makes you feel less willing to be entrepreneurial. And at least where I went to school at Columbia, it felt like you're very much put on a track, and it's sort of uncomfortable to deviate from that.
And lawyers are risk averse, right?
Exactly.
I mean, we're taught to be risk averse, and
totally,
an entrepreneurial venture is by definition risky.
Yeah. And there's a lot of convention around, people, repeat these oh, you have loans you have to worry about, which is a real concern, but there's ways to deal with these things. And, it's good to go to a law firm because you get training for a few years, which I also think is true to some extent, right? But I also think different people want different things, and you shouldn't just fall into what's supposed to be next because of the inertia and convention and any sort of peer pressure that you feel. So, I mean, I don't know. If you have entrepreneurial spirit in you, you can follow it. You absolutely can. You can do what you want with your law license. And I think too many people let the law license own them rather than owning the law license and making a decision for yourself and what you want to do.
Yeah, agreed. And we actually have a podcast episode called Why Lawyers Are Miserable. And I think, but that's one of the challenging things about the law. They teach you to be risk averse. You can feel like you're on a bit of a path. I know my own path. I somewhat ended up practicing big law, and when I was unhappy and looked back, I was like, this probably wasn't a good decision. I don't know why I picked this decision, but partly because it was offered to me, and it seemed like the smart thing to do. But anyway, so side note, just a little plug for, thinking about what you really want and putting your law degree to use in different ways. Okay. But back to visual learning.
Sure.
One of the things we talk about with students we work with and students we run into is that they need to think about what kind of a learner they are. Is there somebody, so Allison has talked about how she's a visual learner. I'm a bit of a visual learner, bit of an auditory learner. We have students who are kinesthetic learners. And, then there's also this debate about whether or not there are different kinds of learners. But,
right.
I'm interested in this idea of visual learning, and does it really create something that can be tapped into by multiple styles, multiple learning styles for students?
Yeah. So, to be complete about it, we consider ourselves to be a multimodal learning platform, just meaning that we use the visual, but we also do combine it with auditory and textual learning to some extent. And we are of the belief that basically any of these as a means to make your brain more active is a good thing.
Right.
I think for me, it's just unbelievably passive learning, and I really have a hard time shaking it being passive learning when I'm reading a book for hours on end. I'm really trying to dive into the material, but it's just you read a few lines and then you're like, I don't remember what I read. And then I don't remember what I read a few pages ago, and that's very passive. So the multimodal learning as a means to being a more active learner, I think is great. Specifically with visual, we do believe that everybody, as I mentioned earlier, benefits from learning through visual learning, in part just because that's how our brains are designed. And referencing back to these MIT cognitive scientists that I've just read a bunch of their stuff, and I can understand 65% of it. But,
yeah, I was like, wow, that's very impressive.
No, it's not, I promise. I'm just trying my best to read it. But
did you have to make a visual learning tool to learn the science behind visual learning? Because that would have been awesome.
That would have been cool, yeah. Yeah, that would have helped probably. It's tough to read, but some of the stuff I could understand was basically their conclusions, which were they were showing pictures to people, and they couldn't find an upper limit to how many pictures people could memorize. And just to compare that to a common textual learning form, think about how difficult it is to memorize your credit card number, or if you hear somebody's phone number once or twice and then an hour later try to remember it. And that's really difficult. But yet they found if they showed thousands of images to people they were testing, that those people could repeat what was in many of those images and could identify, over 95% correctly which images they had seen before. And so I think we're all relatively limited in terms of our ability to memorize large bulk amounts of information through auditory and textual learning alone. And I think we're sort of used to trying to do it because that's how most of our materials are presented to us. That's just how we present materials to one another in the current world. But we just don't think it's natural because, like I said, language is such a recent development in human existence. And so we think visual is helpful for everybody. To what extent depends on... I think that, of course, people vary, and some people do very well with auditory or kinesthetic or any other form, but we think visual is a good thing to add for any type of learner.
And I think what's kind of interesting about this idea too is, you've got your product that's doing, big topic areas, but I've had students, and I know this is something Allison, who's very visual, did in law school, but they will draw pictures on their cases, on the casebook, after they've read the case. And so it's oh, well, there's a boat and a person on the boat falling off the boat, if it's or a boat crashing into a dock. I think, isn't that Peerless? I think they crashed in the dock. But or maybe the criminal ones get really violent. I don't know. But,
right.
But I do think that sometimes forcing yourself to boil things down into a visual picture for a lot of us can be very helpful.
Yeah.
I know even for me, creating mnemonics, I was really into creating mnemonics when I was in law school, but I would memorize them by writing them out, and I had to look at them. I couldn't just like say them to myself. I had
Exactly.
to look
Yeah.
at them, and it was almost like I had a mental picture of it a bit more than just the language. So,
yeah,
it's important as you go through this law school journey for students, or a bar journey, if you're studying for the bar, that you really like play with these ideas, because it isn't a one-stop shop answer for everybody. It's like you can use, products like SketchyLaw, you can use your own hand drawings, but you have to see like what about it resonates with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And I did that a lot too, where basically I think it felt like almost it was a crutch. I was creating like a makeshift visual by drawing things out and writing the words in front of myself in order to memorize them. But I think to some extent that's your brain sort of reaching out to you and it's kind of a hint like, yeah, things are way easier when you can see them, but try it when it's not even words, it's actual images like what you see every day.
Right.
And so anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. We're so sucked into the computer and typing things in class, which we're big fans of not typing your lecture notes in class.
Right.
Still going back to handwriting notebooks and sometimes handwriting your outlines or making flowcharts by hand and things like that, because I think about as passive as you can get is just typing passively at like 70 to 90 words a minute as fast as we can all type now.
Right. I totally agree. And it's like, you're so focused on trying to get the sentences down in time as the professor's saying them that you're not really soaking in the information at all. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
I think other folks who could be interested in trying out these different learning techniques, I could see as some folks with different learning disability or learning challenges, folks who have trouble focusing for long periods of time because your videos aren't particularly long.
Right. Yeah, right? Absolutely. Yeah. And we like to think like, they're about 10 to 15 minutes or so each. And and they focus just on one topic and one concept alone. So it's really like little packages. You can take one and then go do your own thing, whatever you want to do, or go do other things that aren't law related and take breaks too, because that's a healthy thing to do. And then you come back and watch another. But yeah, we've had a lot of response from people who, have some types of learning disabilities or dyslexia and things, being really happy with the product as well. And we're really happy about that. So, yeah.
I think, again, if you're one of those folks who is kind of struggling with that reality, thinking outside the box and exploring different options that may not be the mainstream linear outline solution may be a really good fit. So that's why you start studying early and don't wait until studying towards the end of final exam period.
Totally.
Because you need to try out things to see if they're going to work for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the worst and by far the most common way to study for finals was everybody started circulating the same outline about 2.5 weeks before the final was coming around.
Yeah.
And just
it's unfortunate. Don't do that. You
right.
Be at the top of your class. Start studying early.
Yep, absolutely.
We've got some podcasts on that if you want to listen to more about that. Okay, so you guys work in the med school space. Now you've kind of moved into the law school space. What's kind of the same about what folks are learning in med school and what folks are learning in law school?
Yeah, not a lot in terms of material, but...
thankfully. For me, I'm not a science person, so...
No, me neither. Absolutely not. Really the commonality is just that both require a lot of memorization. I mean, if there's not a lot of memorization involved in studying for a given test, then the bulk of your studying is really practicing your critical thinking or,
right.
Skills-based studying. So like with the LSAT, for example, which many of you are probably familiar with, it doesn't make as much sense for our platform because it's really, taking the materials and just playing with them over and over again in your own head. It's the critical analysis and skills-based learning that you're doing.
Right.
But what we have in common basically is that a lot of law exams as well as the bar is just so much memorization, and same with the boards. So they teach primarily for the med school boards, but also first and second year classes. And similarly, it's we want to make the memorization easier for you so that you have more time to do the analysis portion and really think about the concepts. Once you have them memorized, then you can play with them a lot more, and you have a lot more time during your studying to do the skills-based learning on your own and critical thinking on your own. But the memorization is so scary and overwhelming, especially for the bar and also a lot of law school exams, that it consumes a lot of people's time, and then they don't dedicate enough of their time before the exam to playing with the material because they've spent so much time trying to just remember it in the first place.
So I think in law school, you have the situation where you do have to memorize the material, and then you have to practice applying the material, which is why you do lots of practice exams. And I think one of the things to think about too is taking maybe information that you have internalized through these visual learning techniques, and then making sure you can translate them into the written word. Because one thing that I have seen slow people down on exams is they have the material in their head, but they are confused about how to write out the words. I know it sounds really silly, but I think we can really trip ourselves up by trying to frame the words. Totally. So that's one of the things I would say, especially if you're moving away from an outline where you might have it written down in the way you want it to have it written down on the exam, is just make sure you do practice translating that. So you don't get to the exam and say, I know there were 5 prongs and I know what those 5 prongs are, but like, how do I phrase this so it flows well? There's no time for that.
Totally. And there's no replacing that practice. I think that's something that's really generally, I'm glad you emphasized that, because I think students don't do that enough in my experience, is practice exams. You have to really do those over and over again and be really critical of yourself. And there's no we don't replace that. I don't think anybody replaces that practice.
No, I think if we could come up with a way to replace that, we would all be doing really
rich,
well. I know, exactly. I know. I always have law students and especially bar takers, because it's bar season right now when we're recording this, and everybody wants the easy answer, and it's like, well, the easy answer is you have to do the work. I can't do the work for you. That's just how this works.
That's absolutely right. Everybody wants the shortcut. We do think that I would say we do, in my opinion, come closest to trying to create a shortcut, because we think we make the first task of memorization much more digestible so that you have more time to do what you have to do on your own, which is that work, the practice.
Right. Yeah, exactly. All right. So every time we have somebody who's a lawyer on this podcast, which is almost always, I have to kind of ask about your own law school experience. And since you are so wise, because you've now graduated and passed the bar,
sure.
What would be the lessons you learned in your law school experience that you'd like to share with our listeners, most of whom are kind of early law students?
Yeah. Gosh, well, I mean, first off, I thought law school was fantastic, and honestly, I'm really glad I did it. Even if I never were to practice law, and I do intend on practicing law, but if I didn't, I would still be really glad I went, because of the skills you acquire and the critical thinking skills. I don't think, for me personally, I grew so much in terms of my ability to really analyze and think about given issues. So I'm really happy about that. I think one of the takeaways was what I was talking about earlier, which is going to law school it just means now you're a lawyer. It doesn't mean you have to do anything that you don't want to do. So, do things on your own terms, because I think this isn't so much I guess it's a lesson I acquired through, observing sort of the law school space and the way things tend to go in law school, which was, it felt like, especially I would say to people who didn't take time off between college and law school, that it felt like there was a track you're supposed to be on, and it was scary to ever deviate from that track. And I don't think the track is necessarily bad. Like, for a lot of people, it's great. And the experience of going to a big law firm is great experience and training. But I'm not saying there's no truth to that, but it's just not the only truth. And it feels like the only truth when you're there.
Right.
And you can find other ways to repay your loans. You can find other career paths and things that you want to do that make you feel true to yourself and that you're doing what you wanted to do with your life. So I don't know if that's a lesson I learned in law school. That's more like a warning of what I to help people avoid what law school can do to you.
Right.
But lessons I learned in law school, I guess, the other thing I would say is be sure to like have fun and network and meet people, because there's awesome people around you who have really fascinating lives that I was surprised by the number of people who just didn't really take the time to do that. And these are future leaders in the country, and you'll see peers of yours after law school immediately do things that are just like will wow you and are fantastic and so fascinating. So get to know especially like the quirky people that are around, because they're going to do something really interesting.
I think that's a really good point. And I think, I like the fact that, you used your network outside of law school to create kind of job opportunities for you, since you had these friends in the medical space that you remained connected to. But I think when we talk about networking, we do talk about it as, both in your law school, your legal career starts when you're a 1L, because your peers are going to join the legal profession after that. And you don't know, who is going to cross paths with you, and what a small world this is. I know that you and I are both in the Bay Area, and the Bay Area legal community is teeny, teeny, tiny for as big of a space it is. I mean, there are a lot of lawyers in the Bay Area, but it's got to be just a couple degrees of separation between anybody here, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, I went to law school out here, but I see my friends from law school all the time. I was in jury duty a couple of years ago, and just walking the halls, I'm seeing my friends who luckily were all practicing it, that they weren't just like walking the halls of justice for other reasons. But, I mean, you do have to remember that this is your community that you're a part of, but there are a lot of people doing really interesting things. If you stay in touch, you never know who you might meet.
Absolutely.
And then I always have to put the plug in that, Allison and I met on Twitter. So it's important to be on the online space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And also your professors. Seriously, guys, like get to know your professors, especially the ones you find interesting. Not necessarily the ones, there's the big hitters at your school and everybody's trying to get to know them. And maybe they're really cool and great to know, but any of them, just the ones that you relate well with and get along with well, get to know them and stay in touch with them. Because they're an invaluable resource for the rest of your life. And they're really fascinating people.
And sometimes you need a letter of recommendation. You mentioned you did a clerkship. It's good to have professor friends to write those letters of recommendation for you.
Exactly. Right.
Well, I think that's all really great feedback for our listeners. And I think everyone should check out SketchyLaw.com to learn a bit more about what they do. And with that, we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and ratings on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything in the future. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you could always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. And if they have more questions about Sketchy Law, should they contact you through your website?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can email me info@sketchylaw.com. It goes straight to my phone, so I'll see it. Yeah.
Great. And we will put their website in the show notes as well. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon. Thank you for joining us, Kipp.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. And go out there and memorize, folks. It's important work. All right. We'll talk to you soon.